Hello and welcome to lecture number 3. Today's topic will be the Enlightenment and the era of exploration. The Enlightenment is our first step this semester into intellectual history as opposed to military history or political history. We'll define it and look at some different examples of the ideas developed by philosophers and their arguments. Next, we'll see how these new ideas in this new world set led to exploration and the establishment of empires by the Spanish, French, and English. Let's begin with a definition of the Enlightenment and some common traits. Here we see an image of Immanuel Kant. He was a German philosopher who helped to provide a definition of the Enlightenment. If you wanted to have a particular motto associated with the Enlightenment, well, he provided it, and it was "Dare to Know." Some of Kant's writings are shown here. He argued, the Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed nonage. He further defined nonage as the inability to use one's own understanding without another's guidance. What the heck did this mean? Well, he argued that people should think for themselves. Once one person and then more people do this as a group, all of society can accomplish great things if you just think for yourself. He further wrote, laziness and cowardice are the reasons why a large part of mankind gladly remain minors all their lives. In other words, he argued that we only have ourselves to blame. People are often lazy. You'll remain a minor or like a child, and you could never accomplish great things unless you become enlightened. There are some other traits that should be addressed concerning the Enlightenment, in addition to its definition. First of all, enlightened thinkers questioned everything and attempted to apply rational or scientific thought to the world in which they lived. Let me try to address this idea of how an enlightened thinker would try to explain why it snows so much in Michigan. Prior to the Enlightenment, the old answer was that, well, the reason why it would snow and the reason why we have different weather patterns is, well, God wanted it to be that way. The pharaohs were gods on earth, and they made the Nile River flood and recede from its floodplains. Well, that wasn't good enough for enlightened thinkers. They began to question religion. And instead, the new answer were things like, well, live Doppler radar explains the science behind some weather patterns. And we have this thing called lake effect snow that impacts people living along the shores of the Great Lakes. In the upper left-hand corner of this slide, you see some of the weather patterns. Cold air comes from Canada, and you see where that arrow is and the purple part of that map. There's cold air in the Great Lakes. Well, as that cold air comes across the Great Lakes, it picks up moisture, and then when it goes back over land again, in the bottom map, you see the gray shaded areas that are the snow belts where you have this tremendous snow, lake effect snow, in the Great Lakes. In addition to questioning just about everything in the world around them, another common trait that the enlightened thinkers had was something called deism. Deism was a religious philosophy that questioned aspects of Christianity. Deists believe in God. However, they saw God as a divine watchmaker, someone who created a watch or a clock, put all the pieces together, wound it up, and then never interfered with events on earth again. Another trait that deists had was that they supported religious freedom and toleration for peoples of a range of different faiths. Some Americans were influenced by deism. The best examples would be Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. In fact, Jefferson wrote the Jefferson Bible. What he did was he rewrote the 4 Gospels of the New Testament as a biography of Jesus of Nazareth. He argued that Jesus had a great message and a great idea about treating your neighbor the way you should be treated, you want to be treated, and things like that. However, he ended it abruptly. The last sentence was, there they laid Jesus after the crucifixion, and they rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre and departed. The end. It's missing something. The resurrection. Another characteristic of enlightened thinkers was a belief or a faith in progress. They believed that society was constantly improving over the years. And this idea or this attitude about the improvement of society continued for decades. However, it was shattered by the tremendous death rate and the tragedy of the First World War. But we'll talk about that later in the semester. Next, I'd like to look at some philosophers and the ideas that they developed. One enlightened thinker is shown here. He influenced science, and his name was Isaac Newton. He was able to explain the law of gravity. Newton began to question just about everything around him. As he was sitting under an apple tree, he had an epiphany. He began to understand gravity, and maybe that rational law of gravity that forced that apple to fall to the ground might influence the orbit of the planets around the sun. These laws of motion and of the physical universe that he developed were influential for centuries. While some enlightened thinkers rejected Christianity, Newton did not. He maintained his Christian faith and believed that it was God, the God of the Old and New Testament, who established those important universal laws. By better understanding the earth and the universe, you can better understand God and his actions. Another enlightened thinker is shown here, and it's John Locke, and he wrote about the proper role of government, and he developed something called the compact theory. In this, he argued that everyone has the natural right, a right to life, liberty, and property. To protect those rights, people establish a government. However, that government has to have limited powers. Third, the people have the right, and maybe even a duty, to rebel or to revolt against a government who oversteps its powers. Now, Locke was writing in the 1690s, but he had a major impact on American history. What it did was it provided the philosophical justification for the American Revolution, because the colonists believed that England's government had overstepped its limited powers. Another enlightened thinker who influenced attitudes about the government is shown here. His name was Montesquieu, and he was French. His goal was to try to protect people's liberty from an oppressive government. His solution was that government, or power, should be used to check the power of others. Let me explain. He argued that the best form of government has the government's power separated into different areas. There should be a legislative branch that's in charge of writing laws. You should have an executive, a different executive, in charge of enforcing laws. And you should also have a judiciary that interprets the meaning of different laws. This is the system of separation of powers. Montesquieu's writings are important because they found their way into the United States Constitution. In the upper left, we see the legislative branch. Well, they work in the United States Capitol. On the upper right, we see the White House. Well, that's where the president, or the executive branch, not only lives, but works. And then on the bottom, we see the judicial branch. The highest court in our judiciary is the United States Supreme Court, and that's the building shown at the bottom. Yes, these guys were living and writing centuries ago, but hopefully those previous slides show how they impact us today. Next, I want to look at exploration and the establishment of empires by different European nations. We'll start with the Spanish first. So, I think you're familiar with this guy here. In 1492, he discovered America. Obviously, Columbus did not discover America because there were already people living here. He called them Indians because he thought that he had found a shorter route to the Indies. He actually made 4 trips to what eventually was called the New World, and they're identified in red here. While Columbus never realized what he truly had discovered, he's an important figure because he paved the way for others to follow him. Another Spanish explorer who followed up on Columbus's explorations was Cortez. In 1519, he led a group of about 500 soldiers who landed in what is now Veracruz, Mexico. The arrow here points to the spot where Cortez and his men landed. They came to the New World because they had heard stories about the tremendous wealth of the people who lived there. They moved westward toward what is now Mexico City. Cortez and his men found a tremendous amount of wealth in the capital of the Aztec Empire in the ancient city of Tenochtitlan. In short order, Cortez and his men were able to successfully conquer the Aztecs. A few factors influenced this success that Cortez had. First of all, the Aztecs believed that Cortez was the god Quetzalcoatl, who, according to legend, was supposed to be coming from the east. He would have light skin, and that they should treat him and welcome him to their city. However, maybe an even bigger factor was the disease that the Spanish brought with them. On the left, we see a drawing of the Aztec leader Montezuma, who welcomed the Spanish into his capital city. On the right, we see a depiction of some of the devastation caused by the smallpox, which was unknowingly brought by the Spanish to Mexico. Diseases brought by the Spanish had the biggest immediate impact as it led to the death of many Aztecs. However, one final factor that influenced relations between the two groups would be the technology that the Spanish brought with them: gunpowder as well as horses. One final Spanish explorer is shown here. It's Ponce de Leon. He explored much of what is now Florida. A lot of people don't know this, but eventually a city in Florida was the first European settlement in what became the United States, and this was St. Augustine. The arrow here points to St. Augustine, which was founded by the Spanish in 1565. Again, this was the first permanent settlement by Europeans in what eventually became the United States. Now that we've looked at some of the Spanish exploration, let's change gears and focus on the French. An important French explorer is shown here. He's got a long name: Robert Cavelier Sieur de La Salle. He was important because he explored many areas along the Mississippi River. He was the first European to explore the entire length of that river. He named the area that he explored Louisiana, in honor of his king, Louis XIV. The purple areas of this map show regions controlled by the French. The arrows point to spots along the Mississippi River that de La Salle explored. Another French explorer shown here, Antoine Cadillac. He was a fur trader as well as an explorer. Eventually, in the early 1700s, he founded an important French fort, Detroit. This flourished and was a key trading post for the French. The arrow here identifies the location of Fort Detroit, where the city of Detroit is today. This drawing depicts what Fort Detroit looked like in the mid-1700s. A little different than from today. I'd like to go back in time just a little bit to talk about Pierre Marquette. He was an important French missionary as well as explorer. He established St. Ignace in 1671. He also explored much of the Mississippi River, all the way down to what is now Arkansas. If you've ever been to Mackinac Island, I'm sure you've seen the statue of Pierre Marquette kind of at the base of the fort. The wigwam, shown in the bottom left, shows an example of what a missionary chapel looked like back then. And on the right, we see some of the highlight of Pierre Marquette's actions. Father Marquette started to get sick on that trip down the Mississippi, and so he retraced his steps, tried to get back to St. Ignace, but then he died. Probably near the city of Ludington. On the right, we see an historical marker sponsored by the state of Michigan, identifying Ludington as the death site of Pierre Marquette. I don't know if you are aware of this or not, but up until 1873, the city of Ludington was known as Pere Marquette. That historical marker is located out near White Pine Village on Buttersville Peninsula, if you're familiar with that. There's also a memorial to Pere Marquette, and you see an image of that here. Residents in Frankfort also have a plaque sponsored by the state of Michigan identifying that city as the proper death site of Father Marquette. There's also a cross that's been put into place. And then, a few years ago, a book was published identifying Manistee as the proper death site of Father Marquette. While there continues to be some controversy among historians, most do believe that the Ludington site was the actual death site of Father Marquette. But I guess we may never know for sure. Next, let's look at England's actions as they explored and established their own colonies in North America. So, are you familiar with the first permanent English settlement in North America? It wasn't the Pilgrims. It was in Jamestown, Virginia. The arrow here points to the location of Jamestown. I use this word successful rather loosely because several gentlemen ended up settling in this colony and many refused to work. Following that, many fell ill because of a range of diseases and malnutrition. On the left, we see a recreation of what historic Jamestown must have looked like with its defensive walls. On the right is modern-day Jamestown. It was located right in the middle of a swamp, and disease was rampant. It was a really poor location. In many ways, Jamestown was characterized by tremendous troubles and a very high death rate. In May of 1607, when they first arrived, there were nearly 144 settlers. However, after that first winter, fewer than 40 were left alive. A new leader came to power at Jamestown, and he implemented a controversial policy. You don't work, you don't eat. He's shown here, John Smith. As they entered the winter of 1608, there were 200 settlers at Jamestown. Only 12 died during that winter. The following year, Smith had to leave following an injury. After he left, that incredibly high death rate returned. In December of 1609, there were 500 settlers. However, by the next spring, only 100 remained alive. While the death rate continued for some time, colonists continued to pour into Jamestown. Why? Well, they made a lot of money cultivating tobacco. Rather ironic. It caught on in England, particularly, and in different parts of Europe, and they produced tobacco and sold it and shipped it back to England and made huge profits. Well, now I'd like to talk about some of the conflict between England and France that led to war. We'll go ahead and start with some statistics. While the French occupied a tremendous amount of territory in North America, there were only about 50,000 settlers, compared to 1.2 million for the English. Again, here's that map of North America. The French controlled the interior of the continent, whereas the English were primarily along the Atlantic seaboard in the green area. From the late 1600s to the late 1700s, for nearly 100 years, the French and the English fought over control of North America. Well, rather than addressing all of these wars, I want to focus on the last one, the French and Indian War, which began in 1754. I'd like to begin with a bit of a definition of this war. First of all, it involved the French and their Indian allies versus the British and their Indian allies. What were they fighting over? Well, they fought for control over all of North America. The first battle took place where the circled area is here on this map, near the modern-day city of Pittsburgh. This was a strategic location because it's where three important rivers came together. Well, I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to make a long story short. Fighting in the war began in 1754 and the peace treaty was signed in 1763. The French lost. They also lost their overseas empire as they were kicked out of North America. I want to show this map to demonstrate it. The purple areas of this map identify the regions controlled by the French prior to the French and Indian War. Notice all the purple. This is the same map after the French and Indian War. Notice? No purple in North America. The French lost their overseas empire as a result of this war. Very quickly, I wanted to address the long-term legacy of the French and Indian War because wars are expensive, especially when they're fought overseas. As a result of this war, England had to raise taxes on the colonists. This had a long-term impact on something called the American Revolution, as the colonists didn't want to pay those increased taxes. This also had a major impact on France as well. It led to a financial crisis and a revolution in France, which transformed Europe, called the French Revolution. Well, now that we've covered these items, I'd like to draw some conclusions to the events in this lecture. Well, throughout the course of this lecture, we've defined the Enlightenment and explored some of the ideas of several important philosophers and the exploration of several countries. Overall, what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to write an essay that identifies many of these main concepts and then evaluate something. What do you believe to be the most important result or set of ideas that emerged from this movement? Well, that's it for today. I hope you learned something new and I hope you found it interesting. Take care, have a good day, and we'll see you later.